Hello, I'm Karis. In this video essay, I would like to discourse on the animated reality in the 1961 Walt Disney animation 100 Dalmatians. The film has been a long favorite of mine since I first watched it as a young child, hunched before the screen of an old bulky television in the early 2000s. Advancements in technology across the animation landscape has verily breathed life into what had been 2D sketches, turning them into three-dimensional figures that could move and talk as if they are true-to-life characters, each maneuvering through his plotline with movements and expressions that could precisely mimic that of a real person. Modern animations like Frozen leaves the young audience awe-stricken and mesmerized over the meticulous craftsmanship of their animators. Despite the lavish embellishments and the authentic visual representations of the modern animated films of Disney, I still find the humble production of 100 Dalmatians an uncontestable classic for its representation of an animated reality that comfortably bridges reality with fantasy. Following the disappointing reception of the Sleeping Beauty film in 1959, the Walt Disney team produced what is now the lasting classic 100 Dalmatians with aid of the new Xerox inking technique. The film is a heartwarming adventure story with an abundance of adorable puppies, an enticing villain who is feverishly obsessed with fur, threaded all together by an underlying theme of kinship and amity. The most remarkable feature of this particular rendition of the 1956 novel, The 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith, is the way it creates a fantastical land within a humbly contemporary setting, thus merging fantasy with reality. Set in the 1960s London, the story is the first amongst the Disney archive of animated films to be explicitly situated in its present time. Early animations like Alice in Wonderland and Sleeping Beauty transport their audience to a world of imagined adventures and fantasized happy endings. Audience thus indulges in a condoling sense of escapism as they watch in relief when the chivalrous Prince Philip triumphs over the ferocious dragon and ultimately saves the princess with a true love's kiss. It is hence interesting to learn how the audience would react when fiction is grounded within the context of a familiar reality brought right to their doorsteps. 100 Dalmatians has contemporary features ducked throughout its plot, from contemporary technology such as televisions and cars, to contemporaneous cultural values such as the beauty standards of women as explicated in the beauty magazines and well-clothed females walking their dogs. Even the television shows that the characters watch are shows authentic to the time, such as the 1929 film Springtime. The opening scene is also significant as it relays an air of monotony and colloquiality that is familiar to the contemporary Londoner. The scene opens with Pongo lounging by the window of a cluttered artist studio, boring his eyes over the streets of his neighborhood. The scene begins slow and bare, unaccompanied by music. Pongo's narration thus underscores such a slow stagnancy. "It is a beautiful spring day, a tedious time of the year for bachelors," he says. The scene conveys banality and is thus far removed from fantasy, setting down the tone for the entire film. Besides the opening, the interactions between the characters are also rendered in a charming but believable way. The process of Roger and Anita's acquaintance is unlike that of the love at first sight fiesta that often characterizes fairy tales. The love story of Roger and Anita blossoms in a gradual fashion. It essentially begins with Pongo wanting to acquaint Perdita, a beautiful female Dalmatian. He thus tries to match up his owner with Perdita's owner Anita. Upon their first encounter at the park, Roger casually strolls past Anita, whose eyes follow him briefly before returning to her book. There are no loud declarations of love, only slight glances. These subtle depictions of interests authentically mirrors how love begins in reality. The chemistry between the two slowly unfolds as Pongo stirs up some trouble at the park, forcing the two to be physically linked together by his dog leash. Thus, when the two human characters gradually come together as a couple, they display an authentic sense of flirtiness and intimacy. They hug, they kiss, and Roger caresses Anita tenderly as they dance about their apartment. The representation of love is believable by modern standards, and it pulls its audience back to the reality they know of. Despite being steeped in realistic elements, the story still holds onto a certain few fantastical components, including talking animals, a completely vile villain, and a dramatic plotline with a happy ending. In the film, Pongo the Dalmatian opens the story with a narration, making sarcastic comments about Roger being his pet, as he assesses the women and their dogs who walk past their street, speaking in clearly articulated English. Like most fantasies, Pongo is likely addressing his children audience, as they are deemed to be closer to nature and untainted by culture, and thus they have the privilege of communicating with animals. An interesting point to note here is that this plot has not one human child character involved, thus all the adults in the story can't understand the animals. Every time the plot involves Roger, Anita, Cruella, and her henchman, the narration shifts back to a third-person perspective, with which Pongo and the dogs lose their human voice and are barking again. The second fantastical component is the villain, Cruella de Vil. She is introduced as a completely atrocious villain in the story, incapable of feeling apathy. Having been turned down by Anita in selling her Dalmatian puppies, Cruella hatches a plan to ruthlessly hunt down the puppies to make her fur coat. She is abusive with her two henchmen, Jasper and Horace, forcing them to execute her plans with no allowances for mishaps. It is thus a common trait for fairy tales to juxtapose an unfaulted hero with a villain that is utterly unredeemable, and Cruella epitomizes that villainous character in 100 Dalmatians, eventually meeting her downfall. The last fantastical element in the film, also its defining element, is the happily ever after ending. After Cruella and her henchmen capture the Dalmatian puppies, Pongo and Perdita spread the news to the other dogs in the neighborhood. Their laborious efforts eventually form a barking chain that extends across the city, also known as the Twilight Bark. In the end, the news reaches an old English sheepdog who successfully locates the 99 abducted puppies and, with the help of a horse and a cat, saves them all. The film thus observes the principle of a happy ending, concluding the story with the triumph of the heroes Pongo and Perdita, and the downfall of Cruella and her henchmen. All in all, 100 Dalmatians successfully bridges fantasy with reality, allowing the story to be believable to its audience. Animator Ellen Bazin thus comments about the significance of such a shift in believability of children's animation. She contends that, instead of putting real and fantasy elements at the extremes of their continuum, both were kept, each on their respective sides, hovering around the middle. Different enough to be clearly distinguished from each other, each side still had enough in common with the other that audience could accept that they belonged in the same world. In balance, believability was achieved. Such a believability is significant as it serves as a mirror to the reality we live in. Audiences are able to see themselves in the characters, thus resonate and empathize with them. This also implies that the message of the plot is made more resounding. To put simply, animations are no longer merely outlets for us to escape to, but they are able to mirror reality in a way that reflects the virtues as well as the failings and absurdities of the modern life that we lead.